So we are just thrilled on behalf of the Women's Business Collaborative to host this roundtable. And very quickly, I think you know the Women's Business Collaborative is the business women's movement to accelerate change. And we do it and monitor the data, and we monitor action as we look at more women CEOs, more women in the C-suite, more women on boards, entrepreneur, and capital. And we are resolute with our 47 women business partner organizations, and there are 11 official partner organization under the board initiative with our chair, Anna Dutra, and one of the co-chairs, Esther Aguilera, who will both be very critical to the call today. I think as they set the stage for us, it was to change the supply and demand. It was to make sure that we are advocating and monitoring mandatory laws such as California or Europe and others, and the investment banks and others that will not invest unless women are on boards and women of color. So with that, we will just say thank you. I think all know, thanks to Anna Dutra, we have a partnership with Equilar, and every month we put out the reports of women joining public boards, and the numbers, thank goodness, have been soaring. When we look back a year ago at 22%, since October, we've been averaging 40% women, and in the last month, 25% women of color. So today, because we say let's monitor public boards, private boards, and capital firm boards who sorely need the help, but there's so much interest in women in private boards. And with that, we turn that over to our chair, who's been on many private boards and an astute leader for action, Anna Dutra. Anna?
Thank you, Edie. Thank you so much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And Bethany Crystal, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. For you, it's good middle of the night. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to all our panelists and all our attendees and speakers for today's event. We were able to assemble a panel of trailblazers with amazing backgrounds and representing fabulous organizations as well. Just so that you can start to get to know them, Dana Ostermel, who has been a phenomenal organizer for Bolster and has kept this all together, will drop their bios in the doc, in the chat, so that you can read at your own leisure. But it is my honor and privilege to introduce our 5 panelists to you. Bethany Crystal. Bethany is the board benchmark study research leader for Bolster, our partner organization. Esther Aguilera, my partner in crime and president and CEO of the Latino Corporate Directors Association, where I serve on the board. Fabrice Houdart, managing director of Global Equity Initiatives for Out Leadership. Jeannie Diefenderfer, and once I get all those names right, I get an A+ on this, lead executive director for Ascend and Pinnacle. And Darlene Motley, the co-founder of African American Directors Forum. Welcome all of you, and thank you so much for making time to join us in this super important discussion on how VCs, private equity, portfolio companies, private companies should and can and will bring together more diverse boards. I'd like to mention also that Dana Ostermel is on the chat line and available to answer any questions you have. So introduce yourselves and put your questions and comments on the chat. And I'd like to start by having Bethany, Bolster's research lead, take us through the incredible research that Bolster has conducted. And in fact, it just became public last week. So you're getting this out of the oven. We will make the slides available to you. So don't worry about taking pictures or taking notes, because you'll be able to access them. Bethany, the stage is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I am going to start sharing my screen now, and you should all be able to see the slides. Just a quick nod. Excellent. Just a couple minutes, I wanted to introduce some of the survey data that we've conducted on behalf of the company I work called Bolster. If you're not familiar, Bolster is an on-demand talent marketplace for executives. We have 3,500 executives from a variety of positions in our member network and help them get roles with CEOs at fast-growing startups and scale-ups. We also do a lot of work on placing independent directors at private company boards. And one of the findings that we like to do is to anchor a lot of our research and recommendations in data. And last week, we revealed for the first time a study that we did of 250 CEOs and surveying 650 board directors. So today we're going to be talking through some of the results of that study and some of the implications that it means both for CEOs who run boards, for VCs that sit on boards, and also for anyone who might be a board leader. Here's a just quick screenshot of what some of this survey looked like. Any CEO can go on to Bolster today and complete this survey. It's free to participate. You also get some interesting results about your own board and how it compares to others. So CEOs disclose information about their company, information about the diversity, the composition of their board, and also some compensation details, much of which is also embedded into the app itself. And we're starting to learn a lot about what independent directors play in terms of board diversity. Here's a scope of who was in the study here. So on the right there, you see the breakdown of company stages. We're excited that this is actually one of the earliest stage reports on board diversity. As you can see, over half of companies in the study came from Series A and earlier. And you'll also notice the breakdown of board directors. Of the 650, only 11% of directors in this study were independent directors. When we talk about independence in a board context like this, those are directors who have board seats that are not management directors or founders and not investor directors. And typically a lot of CEOs and boards like to bring those roles on in order to add diverse perspectives. You can see the scope of industries represented here. We indexed a lot on software, computer services, and IT, but really did get a great representation of companies here. I encourage you to follow along on Twitter with the hashtag we've been using since the study release, hashtag #FlipTheScript. And you can also find these results in full at bolster.com/benchmark. So let's jump in. Also would welcome any questions in the chat that you'd like us to come back to later or would like our panelists to come talk about. So one of the most interesting findings in the study is that only one third of boards have independent directors today. This was pretty surprising to us. As I just mentioned, independents are an opportunity for CEOs to bring on diverse perspectives. And in fact, it's not until much later stage, a Series C and beyond, that companies even have independence. This is potentially meaning that CEOs are missing out on opportunities to bring on diverse perspectives for years of their business. But a glimmer of hope that we're excited about is that half of companies today have open board seats. And this is an opportunity to potentially start to change what that looks like. This is not going to be a positive slide, but I think it's important to just know where we stand with these numbers. As you can see, over half of boards today have virtually no diversity. This chart on the right here is showing boards that are fully homogeneous in that small blue line, and then the lighter blue is mostly homogeneous or fully homogeneous. So 56% of boards today are all one gender. 43% of private company boards today are all one race. And if you just add one person who did not make up that, you can see we've got 80 and 87%. So very few boards have more than one person of a different category. That age bracket, by the way, is showing about a 10-year span of age. So we are seeing a little more diversity with regard to age. Another interesting thing to think about as a CEO or board leader is just the configuration of your board. We were surprised to see that nearly 60% of boards have more than one management director or founder and more than 2 investor directors. One thought that we are discussing and suggesting to folks is to think about making room for an independent by giving up an additional seat that you might be having as a management director or founder. That's a perspective that you probably hear all the time anyway. Same thing with investor directors. I'll show you some research later on about some results that another firm found in the right number of investor directors. Interestingly, even number of directors, in some states it's actually a legal requirement to have an odd number of directors on the board. So that's just another thing to keep in mind in terms of how these boards are structured today. This is a glimpse at the gender diversity of individual board directors. Only 14% of board directors today are women. 86% are men. And as I already mentioned, 56% of these boards have no gender diversity at all. And only one of those boards, by the way, is all women directors. So we still do have a long way to go to get to gender parity on these board seats. I did want to point out another interesting finding, though, on gender itself. Here you're seeing a chart of independent directors, investor directors, and management founders in terms of the gender breakdown. So as you can see, women are not as represented as men, but when you look at independent directors, they're about 3 times as likely to be independents as opposed to other roles. This potentially indicates that CEOs are starting to use independence to diversify their boards, and a trend that we hope to see continue with other types of diversity as well. When we come to race and ethnic diversity of board directors, it's interesting to see this finding represented that you kind of know anecdotally, but now we're showing with data. 8 in 10 board directors today are white. And most race and ethnic diversity is not coming from independents, it's coming from management directors. So again, founders of those companies. The long tail of non-white folks on boards is also pretty short. So 80% of board directors in our study were white, about 11% were Asian, and then 2% were Middle Eastern North African, 2% Latinx, 2% Black, and 2% other. So we're really not seeing a lot of racial representation on private company boards today. Looking at age, you saw a little glimpse of this earlier, but a lot of boards do have a variety of stages of age ranges here, and this is just a kind of a bell curve of what that looks like. One of the things that I thought was interesting was we had our research team look into the background of independent directors. We wanted to understand, okay, when CEOs are electing to bring on other folks to their boards, who are they looking for? And what we found is that while over half of independents have postgraduate degrees, about 41% have only an undergraduate or some college degree. So this again to me is showing that potentially CEOs are starting to broaden their scope of who they're bringing on. And this is something that we recommend to encourage looking at different parts of your network. We also did some research into the typical roles and backgrounds of independent directors. About 40% are prior CEOs, 20% were COOs, CFOs or CMOs, and other go-to-market functions were common as well. And we're assuming that as these trends continue, we're going to see even more diversity in who folks are bringing on as independents. The last thing that we covered in our research study was compensation. And again, you'll see more of this if you participate in this tool yourself on our website. But we wanted to share just a couple of things here. Only 2% of board directors today receive any cash compensation. So this is a pretty uncommon way for board directors. And those that did were at the Series C or D stage. An interesting note that's worth mentioning, while it was a really small sample set, we did start to see in our data potentially some gender bias in terms of basis points. So that's the equity provided, where men were potentially given a little bit more opportunity for earning potential in those basis points. So if you're a CEO, really encouraging you to take a look at how your options are kind of laid out and looking for potential bias opportunities that you want to bust early on. Of course, there's a lot of data that we want to be showing you, and I am looking forward to digging into this with some of the other leaders on the call today. But one of the things that we wanted to just mention is that we know at this point that diverse teams build better businesses, and we did some work with some DEI experts to get a couple of suggestions of practical, actionable things CEOs and board leaders can do. So I'll talk through just a couple of these now, and hopefully this will be fodder for some conversation as well. First and foremost, make space for independence on the board. This is that chart I was mentioning. Correlation Ventures ran a study on the correct number of VC, or the number of VC board of director members on their board, correlating that to the returns of the company. And as you can see, they actually found that the optimal number of venture capital directors was around 2. And after that, you start to kind of tail off. So really limiting those investor seats, opting for just one management director or founder. Our CEO, Matt, has a rule of thumb, 1 independent director for every 1 investor as a starting framework. Number 2, bring on independence early and often. If you wait until a stage Series C or D to bring on independence, you're really missing out on years worth of diverse perspectives that someone else can be bringing to that board. One thing that we noted, as I mentioned at the beginning, we run board searches for CEOs that are looking to bring on independence to their boards. And we noted that 66% of CEOs today are open to first-time directors. I think this is a really great opportunity to start to add more diversity. We also noted that 90% of CEOs that we're doing searches with are looking to diversify their boards. So doing this earlier, bringing on folks that might not come from traditional backgrounds, these are all great ways to think about diversifying your board. Number 3 is always be recruiting and building relationships. Recruiting starts with relationship building, not with a pipeline right at the time. And a helpful framing is to think about not just who you are looking for when you have an open seat, but who you're building relationships with along the way. There's this idea of quantifying any bias that you might have. Make sure that if you're a leader, you're not just building relationships with people who look like you, but looking at external networks and holding yourself accountable to that. And again, we know that folks are looking to add on diversity. And I think mentorship is another great pathway to help further some of that initiative. If you're a CEO of a board or a leader, look for ways to build cohesion and inclusion on the board. This is a whole presentation in itself, I'm sure, but just a couple of tips here, noting that bringing on diverse individuals is a great first step. Inclusion is the next step. If you are looking to bring on diversity, be wary of tokenizing folks that are maybe bringing on diversity. Recruit in pairs if you can. Make sure you're making spaces for diverse voices around the table. And some CEOs and groups are starting to bring about different communication norms like bias interruptions. This is a moment where you kind of pause as a group and say, all right, let's check the biases we might be inadvertently bringing to the conversation right now and call out anything that we might not want there. Last is to practice advocacy and broaden access for others. This is particularly true if you are someone who is maybe in the majority position on your board, maybe all white board or an all male board, using that position of power and influence to practice advocacy for others. Noting the difference between allyship, which is giving support, but advocacy is a little bit more of a external defending or supporting those interests in an active way. We also suggest connecting with folks in those networks, helping them find board and leadership opportunities. And something that our board has done at Bolster is actually have folks take on observer seats who are investors and then mentor those who are independent directors to, again, make a little bit more space for those folks around the table. So that was a fast and loose review of our board benchmarking study. As I mentioned, you can see the full study at bolster.com/benchmark. You can also participate if you're a CEO of a company there, but I will pause here and because I know we've got a big conversation ahead. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bethany. This was incredible, very eye-opening. And I know this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? So what I would like to encourage our audience is if you're a CEO, participate. If you're not, join Bolster so that we can have not only more robust data, but also your questions, because my wheels were spinning here. What is the root cause for this and for that? And the interesting thing is that being a director in both public and private company boards, I see all the attention that public companies get, right? And we can make pressure through legislators, through regulators, through proxy advisory firms, through customers. The data is more public, but then private company boards don't get that pressure. So let me start by asking Esther, since we noticed that the percentage of Hispanics on private company boards is just 2%. What stood out for you in this study, Esther? Were there things that surprised you? And what are the ways that you're finding through LCDA to raise awareness for the importance and the potential contribution of Latinos in boards?
Thank you, Anna. And Bethany, that was a really great study, lots in your report. And I would say, for the VC-backed company CEOs and boards, there's ample talent of diverse directors. At our organization, Latino Corporate Directors Association, we are an organization of business leaders, both experienced directors and vetted C-suite and other business leaders that are ready for their boards. So I would say absolutely the idea of having some of the independent seats help you bring in diversity is paramount. And the beauty of that is that we're talking about bringing in individuals with business experience that can help you grow and add value to that company who happen to be diverse. And, I also like the idea of if you are an all-white board, get a slate of candidates that are all diverse, because you're going to find some really terrific talent. And what I've heard from some of the private and public companies that do that is at the end of finding a couple of really great people that they end up bringing both of them on because, they might not be available later on. And I would say, lastly, on this segment, is that, look, investors understand the business value of diversity, and they want companies, both public and private, to better reflect their customers and employees. And I will just quote my sister here, Melody Hobson. She is chair of Starbucks. And what she said is that a lack of diversity on boards is corporate suicide, because boards need to mirror the markets they serve. So I will pause there with those comments.
Thank you, Esther. You talked about the great amount of talent that is out there that's not yet being tapped into, and yet some of that depends on self-identification, right? When we looked at the gender splits in the research and the survey, you have women, men, and then in the other, it's just 0.1%. Fabrice, being the managing director of Global Equity Initiatives, the out leadership, what advice would you give to CEOs and VCs regarding not only the importance of having more diverse boards, but also expanding the concept of diversity and tapping into those diverse segments that are not necessarily self-identifying themselves, and actually give the advice to them as well as potential board candidates?
I'll tell you, when it comes to sexual orientation of board candidates, I'm not going to speak about gender identity, but on sexual orientation, if, the reason why we don't have data is because nobody asks us the question. To be honest, when we get a DNO questionnaire, nobody asks us, are you gay, bisexual, or other? And that's a huge mistake, because the truth is that LGBTQ plus people, if asked the question, will respond accordingly. And we have evidence from publicly listed companies that there is an abysmal representation of LGBTQ plus people. And, of course, it's kind of obvious. The reason why is obvious. That's exactly what, Esther described for Latino, what our friends described for Black candidates, or gender equality, which is that we are slightly outside of the network. And then the other aspect is that sometimes straight and cisgender people are not very comfortable or not very trusting of people that are not like them. And so, we have to do a huge awareness raising campaign to tell companies it is time to collect data on the sexual orientation and gender identity of your board members and to report on that data. And this is not rude and this is not illegal. It is just a matter of paying attention to the sexual orientation and gender diversity of your board members. And then the second element is that we have to tell, and that's the aspect of the offer aspect, we have to tell LGBTQ plus people, it is time now to raise your hand and say, I have the skills, I have the expertise, and I have the interest in contributing to board service. Please think of me. But I think that that one of the key bottlenecks we have to face at the moment is that LGBTQ plus issues is the one aspect of board diversity that is not measured. And what is not measured does not count. And so that's what we're working on at our leadership.
Thank you, Fabrice. And speaking of what's not measured is not achieved, Jeannie, Ascend and Pinnacle specifically represent one of the segments that has the lowest representation in boards as well. When it comes to private boards, what are your recommendations for how and when CEOs and VCs should start to think about diversity? And most important, why should they think about putting more Asians on their boards?
Yeah, so thank you. I would say one of the nice alignment around needs of private boards with all of our communities of diversity, including Asian American candidates, is the fact that private boards are actually a perfect starting point for people with executive experience as a first board experience to get on, because many private boards, actually, Bethany's data proves this, right? In terms of the companies that are coming in the early stages, they really want people with relevant, immediate experience in the operations of the sector they work in. So they look for people who can be a little bit more hands-on than, for example, on public company boards. They want people to come in and give them access to their new markets, give them access to new companies, give them access to thought leadership. And if you look around our communities, we bring all of those things to the table for private company boards, where we can roll up our sleeves and actually work with the CEO and the leadership team and the investment community to advance the company's agenda, because their objective in life is to grow the company and get access to markets so that they can either go IPO at some point and make lots of money in the public markets, or have a strategic direction where they can be acquired or merge with somebody, right? So to me, private companies is so apt and perfect place for all of our aspiring directors in our communities to enter. And I'm glad to see that 60% of the CEOs are willing to bring on first-time directors to their boards, because that need and the supply absolutely should be matched. And organizations like WDC and Bolster can do that, right? And this is a marketplace where we can match them up. And they can't continue to go to their friends, because we all know if you continue to go to the familiar places, we all look alike. So I would encourage both CEOs and investment communities to look for organizations like ours to make sure that they bring on really smart and experienced executives as first-time directors.
Thank you, Jeannie. And you know, I love the fact that you talked about the board career, right? And VC companies and small private companies are the great way to start to learn
Exactly.
what a board is all about, if you like it or not, right? It may not be the thing for you. What do you need to learn before you become a member of a board of a public company or things like that? Darlene, I think that the African-American community has done actually a tremendous job in bringing more African-American presence in public company boards. I actually don't know how successful the effort has been in VCs, in PE companies, in private company boards, where quite frankly, I don't see a lot of African-American directors. Can you help us understand, first of all, what's the secret sauce? How did you make all that progress in such a shorter period of time? But also, what is the situation in private company boards?
Oh, thank you, Anna. Just a couple things with the AADF, African American Directors Forum. It really started from that point of seeing a need in Pittsburgh, and it's really expanded to working with other organizations in other cities. And I say that because it actually has led to our working with some VC firms, primarily out in California. And it's been with that perspective that we really do have to look at the spectrum of people who are participating in those. And I think, Jeannie, you said it so well, that we move away from who we know and our friends, but also how do we help, if that's the way some things do happen, how do we help build that network so that CEOs, others, when they're thinking of people, they do think beyond maybe the immediate circle of whom they've known. So we've actually had a couple events now with VC firms, introducing them to people who are in the fields. And it's the same thing we did with the African American Directors Forum, because I think one of the main things is, while we say there's a lot of talent out there who are capable, people still tend to think of who they know. So they say, well, there's not a lot, or it's the same group and we're all competing for that same small group of people. So we've really worked to try to expand what their network is. So when they're thinking about individuals to come on, that they have a broader network from the founders, from the CEOs, that kind of thing. And that seems to be making a difference. So we have to keep pushing that.
Thank you, Darlene. I would like to actually go back to Bethany now. And one thing that was very interesting was the focus on the study that sheds light on the role of independent directors, right? And so many of those companies still don't have independent directors, and yet we bring so much value to the table in private companies. So a couple of questions for you, Bethany. First of all, given what you learned, what kind of advice are you giving CEOs and VCs about how to think about leveraging independent directors? You talked a little bit about proportions, right, or representation. What is the ideal composition? And then how are those independent director roles being filled today on private company boards? I know that rarely it is through recruiters. I know that some will join, some CEOs will join organizations like Bolster, like Private Directors Association and others, and then they'll seek independent directors there. But what are you seeing from a more formal perspective, Bethany?
Yeah, happy to jump in here. I think the crux of it is that for a lot of boards, there's not a real formal perspective to it, and that's part of the problem. So when I worked before I joined Bolster, I worked for 5 years at a venture capital firm, Union Square Ventures, and typically what happens is there's a round of fundraising raised, the board composition changes a little, and like there's a kind of independent director seat that opens up, and everyone kind of looks through their Rolodexes, see who they know, and then makes some referrals and goes that way. The search can sometimes happen really quick, or sometimes it can get delayed and people kind of wait on it. And I think that's part of why we're seeing the stat that 50% of boards have open seats, is because these seats are kind of largely staying unfilled. So one of the ways that we're hoping to change the script on that with Bolster is to formalize a process. And you can see on our website how we're approaching board searches. I think it involves some coaching with the CEOs, some like identification of where gaps might be on their board, and not just looking at who we know and who's convenient, but where is the current leadership team, where's the current board, and what are the gaps that we need to fill, and how do we make sure we're doing that with diversity in mind?
You know, that's great. And what I'd like to do now is to shift the conversation to help our attendees on this call who are actually seeking board positions, and most important, if it is the first board in private companies. I know Esther, and I am sure that Darlene, Jeannie, and Fabrice, you get the calls, right? You get the calls from companies saying, we are creating a role for an independent director, and we're looking for, what kind of description do you typically get when companies reach out directly to you looking for an independent director? And even more important, if it is the first independent director on the board, Esther, what do you hear? What kind of requests do you get?
Well, sure. And Anna, you started the question also talking about sort of how to navigate the space. So I'll start a little bit there. We've done some panels with private equity. I think for Bolster, Bethany, and the team, I hope certainly this is not our first and only meeting here on Zoom, but many more to come, because I agree with Jeannie that executives who have been in the front lines are terrific for private companies, and depending on the stage of your company, there might be other existing directors that fit. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about the difference between serving on a public company board and a private company board. Why do I say that? Because right now, a lot of executives are getting themselves board ready for public companies, and there is a difference. And as was discussed, for a private company, it is more you're rolling up your sleeves, you are an advisor to the CEO, and the entire board is, especially as an independent, to really help navigate and bring that experience to the table. And for experienced directors, also knowing a lot of them are interested in, they might serve on a couple of public boards, but they're passionate about business and business growth. So there's an opportunity to have a conversation about exactly what that experience is like, further and deeper. The second thing is that, this is a two-way street, that it is both the executive or director that might be interested and the company that's looking. And we know that there is a lot that goes into that conversation. It's sometimes hard without having built relationships to bring an unknown in. So building more of those relationships, both through Bolster, but each of our organizations, our organizations combined bring together some of the most respected and accomplished leaders in business and executives. So you have an ample pool, our groups, and then some. So on the matchmaking, I think if a company is specializing in one niche area, we want to ask executives who has an interest in that niche, and try and do some matchmaking so that there could be more of a conversation, because somebody who's joining that board is going to be putting a lot of time in and is got to have to be passionate about the issue. So that's another piece to the equation here. And, you know, same thing for executives. I think these 2 points apply. Learn more about those differences on serving on public versus private boards, as well as, you know, trying to understand what type of small or VC-backed or private company that you want to have an impact in. So I'll stop there since I know we've got some more great ideas and input.
That is super. Darlene, how do you educate your members on the differences between public and private company boards? I always say that many times private company boards are way more fun, right? Because you get more involved. You're not worried. I have a dear friend who is a CEO of a company that was private for many years and then went public. And he came to me exasperated. And he said, and by the way, Fabrice, he's French too. He said, all I can talk about now is the weather because I can't talk about this, I can't talk about that. So I don't think
but
that
French people are always exasperated, Anna. You know that.
I'll tell you a story about that. Brazilians too, by the way. So Darlene and then Jeannie and Fabrice, how do you explain to your members, to your affiliates, to your people, and to the audience, the difference between serving on a private company board versus a public company board, and especially in terms of expectations and the role that's played, right?
Yeah, that I think Esther did a great job on that already, but I think there's that does require a lot for people to think about, because I think folks automatically think about being on a public board because of the compensation and maybe the glamour of it. But the point that you can learn so much on a private company board, you're going to have a lot more say, really, and can have that right from the very beginning, whereas oftentimes on public boards, you kind of have to learn your way and earn being audit chair or something like that. That oftentimes, depending on what you're bringing to the board, you can start out right out the gate, bringing that expertise and knowledge. But then the other part that we've already talked about, that the compensation is different and can actually end up being even more valuable when helping people understand what those differences can be and why it's of value. And then, as already mentioned, being on a private board and doing really well can also be that stepping stone into a public board, if that's what you want, because as you already mentioned, and Fabrice, as you said, maybe not about friends, but just people who really want to make a difference quickly. I think you can do that faster. And so helping them see just those
completely agree with you.
Yeah.
Jeannie and then Fabrice, what advice do you give to the audience in terms of what questions should they ask about expectations, for example?
So I think the good news on the public company board arena is that we are at a place where there are incredible amount of resources available for all of us to get access to learn about the responsibilities of a public company board job. We also know that things like directors and officers insurance is important because of the regulatory environment and the SEC requirements, and the institutional investors have made it very, very public, right? Particularly of late, of their requirements of public company boards. And Glass Lewis and ISS, they have information up the gazoo that we can learn about that talks about what are their expectations of public company boards and public companies in general. So there's lots of resources out there that we can get access to. Private companies is a slightly different animal. So you have to do a little bit more nuanced research to find out what the company's about. You have to make sure that your expectations are clear in terms of level of engagement that the board and the CEO wants you to have in the operations of the business. And one thing I like about private company boards also is the fact that because most of the comp is in equity, you actually have to think hard about the product or service that the company is producing, right? Because you have to have some belief set into what they're selling and producing, since it matters to you. So we hope it does great, and you have some hands in that. And hopefully in 5, 10 years, or however long you particularly participate, that it's going to give you great monetization later as you invest in equity as your compensation method. So I would say a combination of public and private I found always very interesting, Anna, to your point, because you're right, private companies are so much more fun because you really get to work with them and get engaged. But what's great about public company boards, on the other hand, is the fact that if you think about public money and all of the things that this entire world is involved in public companies and the impact they have in our communities, in the world in general, we have, I believe, a huge responsibility and an opportunity to be engaged, to make sure that we have a say and impact on how they operate and make it better. And we need to bring our diverse voices to the table.
Yeah, and yet 80% of the US economy is run by small and mid-cap private companies, which is really, really interesting.
Right.
Fabrice, what questions would you advise board candidates in this call to ask when they are interviewing for a private company board?
You know, Anna, I always love everything that Esther says on this panel, to the point that sometimes I wish I was Latino so I could join our association.
You know, French are kind of art here, right?
I agree. But I loved our matchmaking allegory. And, you know, I have to say that very often public companies, when they reach out to us to look for LGBTQ plus board member, they are only looking for a partner that is good looking. You know what I mean? They want someone that was a CEO of a Fortune 100, or they want someone that was a cabinet member. You know what I mean? While private boards, they want someone they are going to be happy with, not just someone that is good looking. And so I kind of prefer a private board search, because indeed they will focus on skills and expertise and what is missing at the board table. And so it becomes much more about finding the right partner. You know, right now, you know, for me, for my candidate, for my LGBTQ plus candidate, the question is not as much as how are you going to succeed in the interview, as much as how are you going to make sure that your profile is on the slate of candidates. And you know, one of the things that I've noticed is that now that, you know, there is a little more information about the lack of representation of LGBTQ plus people on boards, I have a lot of white gay guys that raise their hand and say, me, I'm ready. But I have much less lesbians. I have much less gay men of color that raise their hand. And the reason, frankly, is self-exclusion. You know, people that don't realize that the skills that they have really would benefit those companies. And so, you know, a lot of what we're doing now is we're telling, you know, lesbians in company, please send us your profile so that we can try to matchmake you with companies. You know, lately I had a private company that in the real estate area that was asking for an LGBTQ plus board member. And I found, you know, amazing lesbian at Fannie Mae, at Freddie Mac, that had done incredible things and that were at the top of the company. And it had never crossed their mind that they could do board service. So for me, you know, that's kind of the challenge, is to tell those people, you know, your expertise, your experience do matter, and it could contribute to those boards.
You know, that's great insight. Darlene, is that different for African Americans? Or do you face the same similar?
No, I think it's that same challenge in terms of expectations, what you bring to the table. I think all of these kinds of things that we're doing now, though, are helping people to see the level of individuals, the quality of individuals are out there, the knowledge and experience that people are bringing. But it's still this continuation where you have to show people that all this quality and experience and knowledge exists, and it's it's a little surprising, I think, that we all still have to do that when you talk about this spectrum that we're considering. And I have to use your word, Fabrice, where you can get a white guy, and they talk about that for men versus women, right? You have the list of qualifications. Women, they have to meet 9 of 10 before they'll even consider putting their hat in the ring. And the guy is like, hey, I have 2 of these, I'm good to go. So one, working with individuals so they feel more strongly about themselves, but also then the other side of that is the expectation of a person doesn't have to meet 10 out of 10. But, oh, by the way, we actually have people who can meet your 10 out of 10, and you still don't always look at them. So how can we help change that picture?
But that's exactly why you all are leading those amazing organizations, right? And speaking of which, Bethany, one of the things that strikes me in terms of onboarding for companies that are used to recruiting directors is that they got much more sophisticated about it over the years, right? I just joined an advisory board and a company board, actually a public company board, that they had not, in one case, it was the first time they were bringing an independent director. They brought 3 of us. In the other case, they had not recruited a new director in 12 plus years. So they didn't even know how to onboard them. They were asking me, when I asked about onboarding, he said, well, what have you seen that really worked well? And one thing that strikes me is that, number one, if you never brought in an independent director, you don't even know what you don't know in terms of onboarding. But the other thing is that even in the most sophisticated onboarding processes, companies shy away from actually discussing expectations, what we want from you, what we need from you, what type of commitment and all that. How do you at Bolster actually advise CEOs and VCs and private equity companies that are bringing, in some cases, the first independent director for, number one, how to onboard them, and number two, how to have a very clear conversation about what's expected so that you don't have disappointments and frustrations moving forward?
This is probably a much longer answer than our 2 or 3 minutes remaining time will allow, but I'll mention that we've actually done a lot of thinking on this topic as well, and our CEO, Matt Blumberg, has written a 50-page ebook on how to build and onboard new directors to your board. So there's a whole section in there on onboarding. I think you're right in that expectation setting is really important. One of the tips that I took away from that work is the idea of kind of giving people a board buddy so that they have someone else who has been on the board for some time to kind of talk through the financials with, talk through protocols with. We also suggest when you're even looking for independent directors to have someone sitting on a couple of meetings and just see how the communication and cadence flow. The reality is, like every company, every board operates differently and has different norms and communication and cultural practices, or whatever that looks like. And it is a little bit about getting them to feel comfortable fitting in. And then I think on the inclusion piece, some of the advice that we shared in the presentation also follows here. Are you making sure that everyone's voice is getting heard? Are you intentionally calling on people in meetings if they haven't answered a question or haven't participated in a discussion? I think particularly those first few months after bringing on anyone new in any group dynamic, you want to just kind of be mindful about their participation and engagement. And then the last thing I'll mention is surveying boards is also something that our CEO, Matt, likes to do. After meetings, he'll send around a note saying hey, how did I do? How did it go? Anything unanswered? I've also seen VC firms send around surveys about their participation on boards. So maybe some light kind of check-ins, particularly early on, would be really helpful.
So thank you. And I know you talked a little bit about that in the beginning, but I would like to close with you sharing a little bit about Bolster's ongoing commitment to the cause and how people on this call can get involved before I thank our participants.
Amazing. Yes. So a couple ways to get involved. First is we want to continue to build out this industry standard data set about board benchmarking. You can sign up as a CEO on Bolster and participate for free. You also get some even more specific insights about how your own board compares on some of these other metrics. So would definitely suggest that. If you have an open board seat, or if you're an investor looking to diversify a board that's in your portfolio, please give us a call. This is something that we do all day, every day right now. I think we're getting pretty good at it thanks to some of the partnerships with some folks on this call. And also feel free to spread the word, read the study, and stay engaged in the conversation.
So I wished we had a couple more hours because we could go on and on forever. But at this point, I just want to send a huge, heartfelt thank you to Bethany, Esther, Fabrice, Jeannie, and Darlene, and Dana and Lorena, who helped us prepare for that. Thank you, thank you. The work that you're doing is so incredibly important. And I would like to invite Edie Frazier, our fearless leader, to close our session. Thank you very much. It was an honor to share the stage with you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Edie, are you on? Well, since I don't think we have Edie on, I will finish by thank all of you, all the 100+ of you who joined us. Thank you, the panelists, the organizers. Thank you, Bolster. Huge thank you to you. And I wish you all a phenomenal day.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Great
You
job,
were a
Anna.
wonderful moderator. We had a wonderful time.
Likewise, a
Thank you very much.
bientôt.
Wonderful.
Thank
À
you.
bientôt. À
Wonderful.
bientôt.
Thank you.
Good to
Thanks,
see
everybody.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.